Hi, I'm Sam Newman, and I've just released the second edition of my book, Building Microservices. Since I wrote the first edition of Building Microservices back in 2014, quite a lot has changed, and some things have also stayed the same. In the second edition of Building Microservices, I'm trying to bring in some ideas that have emerged since. Lots more conversations around different ways of deploying our microservices using things like Kubernetes and serverless technology, but also really reinforcing some of the messages that were in the first edition. So talking much more about the concepts about how we define our service boundaries and expanding upon that tricky question of should you even use microservices in the first place. I've also expanded the content covering aspects around user interfaces and security, so hopefully it will be of use to anybody who's working with microservice architectures. I think when it comes to microservices, people obsess about the technological challenges or the complexity of, building distributed systems or all of those other aspects. Which Kubernetes platform should I pick? All of these sorts of things. But really, when I think about the hardest problem associated with microservices, it's, well, why are you doing it? Understanding the driving forces that are pushing you in the direction of picking a microservice architecture, making that initial decision as to whether or not this is a good idea for you. I think too many people start their journey towards microservices without really thinking about why they're picking that particular architecture. It's becoming a default choice for so many people. I'm starting to wonder if the maybe hardest part of doing microservices is actually being brave enough to look at your own context and say, you know what, we don't need it. We don't need to do what everyone else is doing. What's right for us is picking maybe a simpler type of architecture. So maybe the hardest part of microservices is avoiding the hype of microservices. If I look forward to what's ahead of us when we're thinking in terms of our microservice architectures, the sorts of things that I'm seeing happening now in terms of more highly abstracted deployment platforms, the use of things like function as a service, I think those trends are going to continue. The future for many of us might be that our microservice architectures are running on top of Kubernetes, but increasingly we won't realize it because we'll be working on high levels of abstractions. I think that function as a service probably shows us what the future looks like for most of us in terms of deploying our software, even if the current generation of those tools maybe doesn't necessarily fulfill all of their promise. So I'm hoping that we simplify some of the infrastructural overhead of managing a microservice architecture going forward. I don't think that's going to be the same as hiding the fact that we're building fundamentally distributed systems. I'd also hope maybe an increased maturity in the industry might lead to us being a bit more balanced in our decision making about whether or not this is the right way forward. But it hasn't happened so far, so let's see what happens. If you're an organization looking to make the most out of microservices, there are some things you're going to have to do to potentially change how you work as an organization to get the most out of this particular architecture. At a team level, you're going to have to get used to making maybe more decisions. Adopting a more of an incremental approach to migration to microservices is very sensible in terms of de-risking things, but that means that you might be called upon to make many more decisions at different points in time and be open to making mistakes. At a wider organizational level, if you want to get the most out of these architectures, you're going to have to understand how much appetite you have for really pushing responsibility into the teams, allowing them to make the decisions they need. And if you're an organization that's maybe used to more centralized command and control, you may well find the migration to microservices is quite a difficult one. So picking my favorite cricketer is a bit like picking my favorite child if I had 100 children. So I'm just going to highlight two that immediately come to mind. The first would be Virender Sehwag. Jimmy Anderson said of Virender Sehwag that he was the batter he least liked bowling to. He'd wake up in a cold sweat the night beforehand, knowing that in that first over, even of a test, Sehwag would try and smack every single ball for six. And, as compliments go, that's a pretty good compliment. The second cricketer would be England's own Sarah Taylor, who is just an astonishingly great wicketkeeper. I think in modern times, wicket-keeping has often just been seen as where you have that swashbuckling lower-order batter. But really the art of being a fantastic wicket-keeper, being in the right place, getting those stumpings, not having to do the spectacular dives because you're in the right place is often overlooked. And Sarah Taylor has been, without question, one of the greatest wicket-keepers in the world over the last 5 or 10 years. Often overlooked, but definitely not undervalued by me.